thank you for listening to my story. I get very excited about what we're doing at the SPE Foundation with our diversity, equity, and inclusion educational initiatives. I have the pleasure of introducing Cathy Nestrick, who is the former VP and General Counsel at Berry Global. She is the founder and co-host of the Parity podcast, which is focusing on accelerating gender equality, and a DEI thought leader and speaker. You can find her on LinkedIn and www.par-parity.com. Cathy, I think, was the first or one of the very first individuals who agreed to serve on SPE's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Board. And I remember the day that she agreed. We were doing the happy dance in the background because her knowledge and passion about diversity, equity, inclusion is really, really empowering to all of us. So I just want to welcome Cathy. Thanks for being here, Cathy. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
Well, thank you so much, Eve, for that introduction. I sure appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is staying warm. It is really cold in Indiana today, but I'm so happy to be kicking off today's fabulous lineup of speakers. And Eve told you all the great wealth of knowledge that we heard from yesterday. So if you missed yesterday, please be sure and tune in, because it really was incredible. I learned a lot from every one of the speakers. So today I'm going to be talking about why DEI is good business. There are plenty of reasons to embrace DEI that are totally unrelated to business. Things like fairness and equity. These are principles that everyone can get behind. Fairness and equality are principles that you might even do if they're going to cost you money. But the really cool thing about DEI is you can pursue fairness and equity. It's not going to cost you any money. And in fact, it's going to make you money. So that's really a unique feature of DEI. So let's jump into the topic of why DEI is good business. So this is going to be our roadmap for the next hour. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a big believer that we all play a role in DEI. And I think it will help you understand where I'm coming from if I share a little bit about me. We're also going to discuss what is DEI, just to make sure we're all level set on what we mean by those terms, and whether the right strategy can solve workplace inequities. And by the way, spoiler alert, I think it can. Next, we're going to dive deep into the business of plastics, and we're going to examine the industries that use plastics. We're going to look at each of these sectors and the customers that they serve, and consider what are they saying and doing about DEI. Because if they're saying and doing positive things about DEI, that's another good reason for you to also be involved in DEI. Next, we'll consider employees. That's you and me. In this section, we're going to look at surveys of how people feel about DEI, how DEI can help us become more productive, engaged, and even help the profitability of our organization. And finally, we're going to look at the investment community. There are some trends underway that I want to share with you. Today's investors are laser focused on value investing, and that includes investments in businesses embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And keeping investors happy is yet another reason why DEI is good business. So Eve told you a little bit about me. I've spent the last 30 years as an attorney, with the last 10 years in the plastics industry. I retired from Berry Global last May so that I could focus full-time on DEI. While at Berry, I was the Vice President and General Counsel and the founder of Berry's Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. And today I'm the co-host of a podcast called Parity Podcast, where we focus on gender parity. I also work with businesses, sorry about that. I also work with organizations who are trying to implement or advance their DEI strategy. My approach to DEI is data driven. I don't do or say anything unless it's really backed by good data and some good old-fashioned common sense. So you're going to hear a lot about data from me, and I think that some of these strategies will be helpful for you in your business. So let's now move on. I want to tell you a little bit about my journey. My parents raised me with the belief that girls could do anything that boys could do, and I believe them. I believe that women would have the same opportunities as men. My mom was particularly vocal about this because her parents told her she could be a nurse or a teacher, and those were really her only career options. But her main job was to become married and have children. And while she did have a very long, still has a very long, successful marriage to my father, they've been married 55 years, she does feel like she missed out on an opportunity in the workforce. She wished she could have been born in my generation. She wished she had the opportunities that I had. And talking to her, it is a nice reminder that we have made progress, but there is still a long way for all of us to go to achieve justice and equality. So I went on to attend college and law school in the 1990s. And at this point in time, it was pretty much 50-50 men and women in college. The girls did tend to get better grades, but we all felt like we had equal shots at jobs. So we entered the workforce expecting more equality than what we actually found. One of my earliest experiences as a young lawyer was when I appeared before Judge Palmer. And by the way, this isn't really a picture of Judge Palmer, although the likeness is eerily similar. So I asked Judge Palmer to sign an order to repossess a car because the car owner wasn't paying the bank loan. And what I didn't know at the time was that the owner of the car was a good buddy of Judge Palmer. So the judge, he refused to sign the order. What he did next, though, has stuck with me the last 30 years. It wasn't that he didn't sign the order, it's what he said. Before I left, he called the only other judge in this county, and he said, "Earl, there's a girl in my office. She asked me to sign an order, and I told her no. She's probably headed to your office next. I just wanted to let you know." And of course, the other judge didn't sign the order either after that phone call. I'm sharing this story with you because this judge, he insulted me publicly, and he did it by calling me a girl, which shouldn't be an insult at all, but we all know that's what he meant. He was mad that a girl would dare to challenge him and his good friend, and he was letting everyone know and putting me in my place. This was my first brush with gender bias, at least the first brush that I sort of remember and recognized. I didn't think of it as gender bias at the time. It frankly didn't even occur to me. But looking back, I can see that it and many other similar types of situations were a result of bias. When I would come up against a bias in my career, I would just keep my eye on the ball and keep working or work harder. And, you know, I don't want to dwell on this story or my other experiences of bias because they don't define me. That's not who I am. I've been knocked down. I'm sure everybody in this who's tuning in today has been knocked down, and we all stand back up. But these experiences did drive my desire to work in DEI. They helped me see that I'm not the only one experiencing bias, but others are too. I can see it better now. I have greater empathy for people who I can see are experiencing bias. I am now more energized and confident to speak out against that bias. And so these experiences with bias, they can inform us and help us on the DEI path as we're all seeking greater justice and equality. So as I mentioned, I wasn't really paying attention to gender bias during my career. It's only been in more recent years, like in the last 5 or so years, that I began looking back and thinking about my work environment and wondering, are there forces that are around me that are impacting whether or not I succeed? And until I had this awakening, when I faced obstacles and setbacks, I assumed that I wasn't getting something because of something I was doing. If I was interrupted, for example, I assumed it was because I wasn't being commanding enough or informative enough. When I didn't receive an opportunity, I assumed it was because I wasn't skilled enough. And of course, some of this is true. I could acquire more skills. I could be more forceful. But I did begin to imagine the possibility that there were things that were happening outside of me that were beyond my control, and that these things happening outside of me were impacting my career and my trajectory. So I started looking in the data, and this is what I found. More women graduate from college than men. And this includes all the degrees. This includes the 4-year degrees, the master's, the PhDs, many professional programs as well. So we earn more degrees than men. This tells us that women are ambitious and we're hardworking. We want the job. We want to be successful in the workforce. So I then looked to find out, well, what's happening when women and men enter the workforce? We enter in roughly equal numbers from college programs and other programs. But men receive more promotions beginning with the very first promotion. This doesn't make any sense. If women earn more college degrees, we should be earning more promotions, but instead we're receiving fewer promotions. Now, the next point is predictable. If men are receiving more promotions, then there are going to be a lot more men at the top of the organization than women. And so I think probably many of you have heard the data point that there are more CEOs named John than all the women CEOs combined. There are also more CEOs named David than all the women combined. So if you add John and David, and you put them in one group and you look at the women in the other group, what you're going to find is there are 2 times as many men named John and David as all of the women CEOs combined. And the situation is even worse for people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. Women of color hold only 3% of the C-suite positions. Clearly, the intersection of gender and race create many more obstacles for women of color. When I looked at this data and considered my own situation, I concluded that my parents were wrong. Girls don't have the same opportunities as boys, and that doesn't sit well with me. And what this also tells us is that we're talking a lot about DEI, but we're not doing enough. We need to do more to correct inequalities. So, is DEI a solution to these inequalities? And the answer is yes. We are fortunate to be talking about DEI now. You know, I've heard people say, oh, we're kind of coming to this late. There are lots of industries, there are lots of businesses who are already have been on this journey longer than we have, who have more mature programs than we have. But I choose to think of this as the glass is half full. And I think we're fortunate to be talking about the conversation about DEI right now, because the first companies that started these initiatives, they didn't always get it right. And in fact, many of them failed. Some of these companies actually, they tried to do things that not only didn't work, but sometimes they made bad situations even worse. And in these early cases, diversity actually declined in companies that were focused on diversity and inclusion. But we can learn from their mistakes. And so that's why I say the glass is half full, that we're having these conversations now. We now know that there are equitable people practices that work. For example, I'm going to tell you the story about the New York City Symphony. It was nearly all male in the 1970s, very few women. I think it was 6%. And someone had the idea that why don't we do blind auditions? We don't need to see people to know whether or not they can play their instruments correctly and well. Let's do blind auditions. So people would come on the stage behind the curtain. They somehow muffled the sound. You couldn't hear the click, click, click of the women's heels. So the people who are making the decisions, the decision makers, they had no idea what the gender was of the person who was playing the instrument. And what they found was that by doing these blind auditions, the number of women who are now involved in the New York City Symphony went from 6% to around 50%. That's a pretty incredible story. And of course, other symphonies are now mimicking this. And so it's not just in the New York Symphony, but we have lots of symphonies where now women are getting an equal shot at participation. You may have heard this story before, but the thing that I really like about the story is not only did diversity win, but the orchestra won, music won. And this is why I say that. Remember, these were blind auditions. And so the decision makers were able to think only about and listen only to the music. And they picked the people who could create the best music. And so today we've got better musicians. And so if we go listen to the New York Symphony, we're going to hear more talented people play because the decision makers were not distracted by unconscious bias or gender bias when they were making their decisions. Before we jump into other ways that DEI is just good for business, let's make sure we understand what each of these terms means. So let's talk about diversity. Diversity is about employing different kinds of people so that there are different ways of thinking infused within your organization. When I say different kinds of people, I mean people of different genders, races, ethnicities, abilities, sexual identities, but I also mean things like attending different schools, traveling overseas, holding different roles. Diversity can mean a lot of things. It's a broad concept. The general idea is that more diversity is better. Equity is different. Equity is about fairness. It requires us to look at the people practices within your business. For example, your HR could use blind applications just like the New York City Symphony used blind auditions. Using this equitable practice might help to improve the diversity within your organization. A name can tell you the gender, race, or ethnicity of a person. And there have been a number of studies done in many different countries that show that people's names can hurt their chances of being hired because of unconscious bias. So blind applications are one equitable solution to this dilemma. Let's now look at inclusion. Inclusion is different. Inclusion is about your culture. Does everyone believe they have equal opportunity for success? Is your culture safe for people to offer their ideas? Are women interrupted during meetings and calls? There have been many studies about women being interrupted, including one of the US Supreme Court. 3 of the 9 justices on the US Supreme Court are women. And somebody just watched a number, a year's worth of their arguments, and they counted the number of times that the women were interrupted versus the number of times that the men were interrupted. And the women were interrupted, all 3 of them, many more times than the men. So what this tells us is that this interruption of women happens at all levels of organizations and all levels within our society. And the tough thing about interruptions is when women are interrupted, it is very difficult for us to get our ideas out on the table. And the benefits of diversity are you want to hear diverse ideas. And if we can't get them out, then our diversity is not adding value to an organization. So when combined, diversity, equity, and inclusion can transform your organization. Now we're going to take a look at how DEI is good for business by considering our customers. I now want you to think about your organization and your customers. We need to uncover whether DEI is important to your customers. Because if DEI is important to them, then DEI ought to be important to you. As I mentioned earlier, I worked for Berry Global for about 10 years. And in my role, I would often consider who are our customers and what do they think about DEI. And I was able to see that many of Berry's customers are making major investments in DEI, and I bet a lot of your customers are as well. For example, let's take a look at Coke, Pepsi, and Unilever. These are three of the big brands that are out there. And you're going to see major space dedicated for many of the big brands about what they're doing for DEI. So let's start with Coke. As a consumer-facing company, they want their workforce to mirror their customers. This is smart business for them because consumers are increasingly demanding that their brands look like them, that their marketing reflects them. Consumers want to see themselves in their brands. And this pressure is some of the same kind of pressure that resulted in the Washington Redskins being renamed the Washington Football Team. It's also resulted in some rebranding of different products like the Aunt Jemima's pancake mix, Uncle Ben's rice. There was the Land O'Lakes butter. They all had stereotypical racial imagery. And the pressure from consumers has caused them to change all of this because consumers want to see themselves reflected. Now, we can't talk about Coke unless we also talk about Pepsi because we're going to be inclusive today. And of course, Pepsi's statement is all about inclusion. They are committed to fostering a workforce that is committed to creating equitable and inclusive spaces where everyone has a voice. Because as I mentioned earlier, if people don't have a voice and aren't getting their ideas out and heard, then organizations aren't receiving the benefit of diversity. The last big brand that I want to take a look at is Unilever. This is another example about how big brands are positioning themselves with DEI, and Unilever does not mince their words. They say too many people are denied opportunities and are excluded. Too many people are underrepresented simply because of who they are. The system isn't working. There is no question that Unilever strives to be a change agent when you look at this language. If Coke, Pepsi, or Unilever is your customer, or if they're in your supply chain, then it is good business for you to invest in DEI. But let's take a look at other companies and industries who are customers of plastics. I'm sure I'm going to leave out some, but I want to talk about the top industries using plastics and the largest customers within these industries, just to get us thinking along the lines of what are our customers doing and thinking. So the top industries using plastics are aerospace, construction, electronics, automotive, energy, packaging, furniture, and healthcare. Think about your business. Do some of your customers or their customers fall within these industries? Maybe you sit within one or more of these industries. Hopefully, I've identified enough industries for you to begin thinking more critically about your customers and their views on DEI. Now let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's take a look at the first four of these industries: aerospace, construction, electronics, and automotive. What I did is I tried to identify what are the top businesses within each of these industries so that you can think about, are these our customers, or are there other customers sitting within these industries that are our customers? And the top companies in aerospace are Boeing and Airbus. They have robust DEI initiatives. The top in construction are Bechtel and Turner, again, robust DEI initiatives. For electronics, you have Apple and NVIDIA, and for automotive, Volkswagen and Toyota. If you go look at their web pages, you're going to see a lot of space dedicated talking about position statements, what they think about DEI, what they're trying to accomplish with DEI, activities, impact that they're making, what are their goals, have they met their goals? So lots of activity, and you can get some really good ideas for your own organization by taking a look at what these folks are doing. I also wanted to see what's going on within the trade organizations that support these industries. And as you might expect, there are a lot of trade organizations supporting these industries. But I did want to find what appeared to be some of the top trade organizations. And again, all of these trade organizations are involved in DEI as they're supporting their industry with these initiatives. I also did the same with the next four of the industries. We have packaging, furniture, healthcare, and energy. Packaging is a little bit, it's a pretty broad industry sector, but I picked out Kroger for food, for groceries, and P&G for personal care, Yum for fast food. All of them have very robust, very mature DEI programs that you can read about. Furniture was IKEA and Williams Sonoma. There is another furniture company, Ashley Furniture, that's one of the largest in the US. They don't say anything about DEI. It was the only company that I looked at in each of these industry sectors that didn't have a DEI initiative. It maybe they have one. I don't want to say that Ashley does not have one. I just didn't find evidence that they have one on their webpage. Healthcare, the two largest are CVS and United Healthcare. They have lots of stuff going on with DEI. And then finally, energy, Chevron and Exxon are the two largest, and they have very robust DEI initiatives. And as I did with the other energy sector or the other industry sectors, I also looked to see what are the top trade organizations doing in each of these industries. And they are all very involved in supporting DEI, lots of education and other programming that you'll see within these trade organizations. So this exercise showed me how embedded DEI is around plastics. Maybe it's not inside plastics as much as we'd like it to be, but it is around plastics. It's out there and it's in our supply chains. In my view, the train has left the station on DEI. And if we don't get on board, we will be left behind. And it's just good business for these reasons to pursue DEI. And to the extent you already have DEI initiatives, to grow what you have. So we're at the end of the customer portion of my presentation. We're going to talk about some other things, but I want you to think about these things, these questions, as you go back into your organizations. Think about who are your customers and who are their customers. Take a look at your entire supply chain. What are their DEI objectives? What are they trying to accomplish? What are they asking you about your DEI strategies? And if they're not asking you yet, they're gonna be. And if they're, and another thing to think about is, as they're asking you questions, the questions are going to become more and more detailed over time. So at the beginning, they may just ask you, are you doing anything for DEI? Yes, no. But over time, it's going to become, what are you doing for DEI? What are your goals? Are you meeting those goals? What other impact are you making? And so things are going to become from less detailed to more detailed. And they're also going to go from not mandatory to, if you want to do business with us, then you need to be doing these things. They're going to become mandatory. We can see it in how customers have treated us over time with respect to other issues. And there's no reason to think that DEI is going to be any different. You can also learn a lot about your customers just by seeing what are their public statements. Are they making press releases about DEI? What are they posting on social media? What do their web pages say? So there's a lot of public information for you to assess what's happening with your customers. So now we're going to stop talking about customers, and I want us to now think internally about your business. And I want you to think about what do your employees think about DEI? What do you think about DEI? Does DEI align with your personal values? And is it important to you that your organization have values that align with your own values? For those of you who are millennials, most millennials want to work for companies whose values align with their own. I'm not a millennial, but I want the same thing as well. DEI is a solution that can help you attract and retain top talent. Those people who, it will help you attract and retain those people who care about DEI and those people who believe that DEI values align with their own values. So I want to share with you some survey results. And, you know, these were mostly US based national surveys looking at what are people's viewpoints on DEI. Pew conducted a survey in 2019, and CNBC conducted a very similar survey in 2021. Both found that an overwhelming majority of people want to work for companies that promote DEI. Now, I want to pause on this for a minute, and I want you to ask yourselves, when was the last time 75% of Americans agreed on anything? This is, to me, these are startling numbers, and this is data that can really help you make the case for why you need to start DEI or grow your DEI initiative. Now, these numbers could be different within your organization. They might be lower, they might be higher. One thing you could do is survey your workforce and find out. If your workforce is aligned with these numbers, a business benefit of DEI is that by engaging in more DEI, you will reduce turnover and increase engagement because you're going to be doing something that your employees agree with. So let's take a look at some other surveys that focused on racial inequality. Surveys by Quinnipiac, CNN, and Gallup specifically asked about racial inequality. And again, a majority of Americans want to see improvements. All three of these surveys were conducted in 2020, so it's fresh, pretty new information. And they generally found that 2/3 agree that racism is a big problem. And 50% say racial minorities have unequal job opportunities. So clearly, there are many people who want to see change, and some of these people are members of your workforce. Let's also take a look at what how people view women at work. The Modern Family Index conducted an extensive study in 2,000 people about how people view women, and particularly working moms. You may not realize this, but there is significant bias against working moms. 40% of our coworkers believe that we are less committed to work after we have children. When men have children, they are perceived as more responsible, more mature, and they often receive more opportunities and bumps in pay. Women have the opposite experience. When we become parents, we lose out on opportunities, we lose out on projects, and as a group, and as a result, our pay goes down as a group. So Modern Family wanted to tackle this issue. They wanted to understand, how do people really think about moms? Are there some skills that moms have by being parents, by spending a lot of time with young children? Things like, are they better time managers, for example? And they wanted to find out what people really think, if we can get them away from this bias. And the results of this survey were that 85% of all people believe that organizations need more moms in leadership roles because they do bring some additional skills to work that they honed during their parenting years. LeanIn.org also took a look at the gender pay gap, and 75% of Americans think that the gender pay gap is unfair. Pew in 2013 took a look at whether Americans believe that there's a gender gap in hiring and promotions when it comes to top jobs in business and government, and 50% do believe that there is a gap, that it is harder for women, and particularly women of color, to have the same opportunities as men. So clearly, many of you and your teammates want more investment in DEI, and you think that racial and gender inequality is a big problem. For businesses that invest in DEI, you should be able to attract and retain more talent and improve engagement and productivity if you're more focused on DEI. All of these outcomes are good for business. DEI strategies can also make your workforce more innovative and profitable. We heard this from a couple of the speakers yesterday. Increasing women in leadership roles increases profitability. Increasing employees who identify as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color increases profitability by even larger margins. Businesses with greater diversity are more likely to out-innovate their competitors. These outcomes are all good for business. Now, you'll notice I included where I got this information, because I think that data is important and where we're receiving our information is important. And I'll tell you, I rely heavily on McKinsey, Gartner, and Harvard Business Review. I think highly of their data, their methodology. I think they do a nice job with these studies. They also conduct these studies year over year. These are not one and done studies. So they take a look year over year what's going on, and that gives us also more comfort that the results are accurate. I wouldn't bring these numbers to you if I didn't have high confidence in them. So this is the end of our discussion about your workforce. And these are the questions I would like for you to ask yourself and your organization about your employees. Have you asked your employees what they need to be successful? Do underrepresented employees believe they have equal opportunities in your business? If not, what practices can be implemented to ensure equity? Has your organization conducted a pay audit to ensure that there are no pay gaps on the basis of gender, race, or other factors? And can DEI strategies reduce turnover and increase profitability within your teams and organizations? Let's now pivot and talk about the investment community. There is a trend underway on social investments. People want to invest their money in businesses and industries whose values align with their own, right? We talked about that earlier. People want their brands to mirror them, and they also want their investments to mirror them. We've just seen some pretty incredible data about people's views on DEI and specifically on racial and gender bias. The investment community is providing leadership, or maybe they're just capitalizing on an opportunity, and we, the people, are providing the leadership, we, the consumers. But regardless of whether it's consumers, the investment community, or collaboration, investors are important to your business, and investors are increasingly focused on DEI. So let's take a look what's going on here. There are 20 asset managers led by Vanguard, BlackRock, and Capital Group that hold over $300 billion worth of shares in plastics companies. When we take a look at Vanguard, BlackRock, and Capital Group, I wanted to see, what do they think about DEI? Do they have DEI initiatives? What are their values with respect to justice and equality? And BlackRock is leading the way. BlackRock says that DEI is more than a strategy. It's a mindset embedded at the heart of everything we do. Vanguard says that their commitment to DEI is long-standing, and they've amplified their efforts in recent years. Capital Group says that we invest in our DEI goals with the same boldness and rigor as we do with other issues. And that statement really speaks to me. Over the years, I have seen many times that if there is a significant business problem, issue, or challenge, there is a call for all hands on deck. There are resources brought to bear, and that problem is solved. If we focus, we solve it. And I really do believe that if businesses took the same approach with respect to DEI, we would see some major transformation with respect to equality in our workplaces. So let's look a little bit more deeply with BlackRock. As I mentioned earlier, they're a leader in this space. I wanted to share this letter. It was written by BlackRock's CEO to all CEOs. Their CEO's name is Larry Fink. And this is, by the way, just a very small segment of a very lengthy letter that he wrote. I wanted to pull out the DEI content. There's a lot of other content. For example, he talks a lot about sustainability, and I know a lot of you have just as much interest in sustainability as you do DEI. So you might want to go check it out. But I pulled out this segment, again, focusing on workforce issues. And he wrote, "The pandemic shone a light on issues like racial equity, childcare, and mental health. He says that these issues are now center stage for leaders to be thoughtful about how they use their voice and connect on social issues important to their employees. He cautions leaders to show humility and stay grounded in their purpose." I think this is a pretty extraordinary letter because it's written by someone in the investment community. And we don't typically think of the investment community as being a leader with respect to workforce issues, employee issues, DEI issues. They seem to be more for the CEOs, right? And the C-suite. But they're really talking about a more egalitarian approach to how business is run. And again, this is written by the largest asset manager in the world, the CEO, Larry Fink, F-I-N-K. So I view this as some powerful stuff. And you might want to Google and read the entire letter because, again, it talks about sustainability and some other things as well. The final point I want to make on investing is about ESG reporting. I've only got one slide on this, so we're not going to get too far into ESG reporting. And frankly, we could spend an hour just talking about ESG reporting. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And they are standards that were initially published by the United Nations back in the 1960s. And for years, people just sort of ignored this. I mean, there were people paying attention, but mainstream world was not paying attention to the ESG standards. Because of more recent events and the focus on DEI, they're now receiving the attention that they deserve. You can find these standards at globalreporting.org. If you try to Google them, it's going to take you forever. So if you're interested, be sure to write that down, globalreporting.org. We talked earlier about how consumers want to invest in those companies whose values align with their own. And then the ESG score of a company can help us understand that. We can see not just what brands are saying on their webpage, but there's an actual score on how well they're performing. Companies with higher ESG scores are going to win more of these investment dollars. And by these investment dollars, I mean the dollars of people who care about DEI, who care about social impact that corporations can and should make. While most of the companies that do this reporting are publicly traded, this is not required. Many unlisted companies also participate. So again, this is sort of an introduction to the topic. I'm not talking a lot about it. If you want to know more, I can share some further resources. So just don't hesitate to reach out to me by email, and I'll share with you what I have. So with respect to investors, these are the questions I'd like you to be thinking about. Who are your investors? What do they care about? What are their DEI objectives? Do they talk about DEI on their webpage? Are they asking you about your DEI strategies? You know, that's a big one. Are they asking you about what you're doing? And then what public statements are they making about DEI? For example, the letter by Larry Fink. So if the bottom line here is that if your investors care about DEI, that's another good business reason for you to care about DEI and for your organization to either start a program or to grow what you already have. So we're getting near the end of my presentation. I've got a couple of more slides, but I wanted to summarize what we've talked about. DEI is good business because it's the right thing to do. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and you probably wouldn't have tuned in if you didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. Justice and equality and equity are the foundation of DEI, and you know, we all can get behind justice and equity. Consumers care about DEI. We talked a lot about that, how consumers care, and that's a big driver. That's a driver for our customers. It's a driver for us individually. It's a driver for our team members, and it's also a driver for the investment community to also care. So if all of these people care, that's a business reason for you to also care. If your customers care about DEI, you should too if you want to stay competitive with those customers. If your employees care about DEI, then you should too if you want to reduce turnover. And who doesn't want to reduce turnover? Or if you want to increase your productivity, your engagement, your employee satisfaction. And we all want to do those things. We also talked about that if your investors care about DEI, then you should too, if you want your fair share of their investment dollars, and who isn't going to want that? So all of these are some of the really good reasons that DEI is good for business. I wanted to share with you a resource for further learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I'm constantly reading, listening to podcasts, watching TED Talks, etc. My go-to data resources for DEI are McKinsey, Gartner, and Harvard Business Review. I look at a lot of other things too, don't get me wrong, but I feel like these three are some of my mainstays that I'm constantly referring back to. Podcasts, I've got to give a shout out to my own podcast, right? We work hard to bring data into our podcast episodes. And I'm proud of it. So I wanted to include the Parity Podcast. I also want to give a shout out to Plastics. Eve mentioned Plastics earlier. We heard from one of their co-hosts yesterday. And Plastics, while it's not DEI focused, it is a podcast co-hosted by two women. And they are talking to different people within the organization or within the industry. And so it really is a great place to hear from diverse voices within the industry. And finally, I also wanted to give another shout out to Beyond Plastics. It's not yet out there, but it is a new podcast that's going to be launched in April. And it's going to be focused on DEI and manufacturing. It's going to provide some education, as well as some practical tools on how to start or grow your DEI initiative. Some of the books that have really, I read, and they're books that I have referred back to, I've really thought a lot of. And those books are Better Allies by Karen Catlin. You can also follow Karen on LinkedIn and Twitter, and she, on a very regular basis, will give you tips on how to be a better ally. She will also give you tips on how to be more inclusive at work, and they're very practical tips. So really recommend following her and picking up her book. Also, I wanted to give a shout out for Wild Hair, which is a book by Tracy Edmonds. Tracy is a former chief DEI of a Fortune 500 company, and she has left her company and has started a coaching business on her own. She coaches women, and particularly women of color. And she wrote a book called Wild Hair, which is about her finding her voice and authenticity in the workplace. Really good book. Also wanted to point out the All Report by Diane Primo. Diane does a lot of work in the ESG space. You can also follow her on social media. The All Report isn't so much about ESG. It's really focused on cultures. Because we have to have the right culture in order to achieve greater equality within our workplaces. Loved How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. This book is about how you really need to, you can't just not be racist. You have to lean into it. You have to be a proactive ally. You have to be anti-racist. And it gives great tips on what that means and how to do that. And finally, as a white woman, Waking Up White by Debbie Irving was really good. It's one of those books, I read it a couple of times. I led a conversation with a board actually, that wanted to understand white privilege better. And I understood white privilege, but not as deeply as I did after I read this book. And I'm also able to see it more easily now. And of course, that's because I'm white. That makes it more difficult for me to see it. The book was very, very helpful for me, and I highly recommend that book. So we're now at the end. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I really do value your input. I've left my email here, cathynestrick@gmail.com. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions or comments that you have. And I'll be joining you a little bit later with our Q&A in an hour or so. Scott, can I turn it back to you?
Yep, go ahead, Eve.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. That was really wonderful. I'm going to look into those resources. Some of them I'm very familiar with, a few of the books, but you've given us a lot of resources and a lot to think about. We do have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 minutes before I need to introduce our next guest. And I was wondering if I could just ask you a question right now, Cathy.
Absolutely.
So in the beginning, when we were learning more about your journey and you were talking about the bias that you felt as a female in the legal profession, and I felt the same as a female in the engineering profession, how do we recognize unconscious bias in ourselves? Because as someone who's, been on the receiving end of that, we want to make sure that we're not doing that to other folks.
That's a great question, Eve. And when I started my career, and probably when you started your career, unconscious bias wasn't talked about. At least I didn't hear about it if it was. But there's some really great resources out there that you can use. But for me, I think there are a couple of important things to think about. One is we all have unconscious bias. If you don't think you have bias, you do. Trust me. And the way for you to really be able to assess your own unconscious bias is if you go to Harvard Implicit Bias Test. They have multiple different tests that you can take. They're online, they're free, they're quick, they're easy. And you can test your bias on gender, race, ethnicity, religion. There's a whole host. Age is one of them. There are several out there, and I've taken many of them, and I have bias. I have bias against women. I'm going to repeat that. I have bias against women. And what does that mean? What that means is I was raised at a time when there were more women staying at home than there were women working. For the women who were working, they were maybe more part-time. Not that there weren't women really kicking it, okay? I'm not saying that, but they were far and few between. And so I saw this, I took this in. I also watched movies and read books about women who were not leaders within businesses. And so all of this sort of settled in my brain and created an unconscious bias. And if I think of the word leader, I'm getting better and I'm more likely to think of a woman, but it's still, I have to sort of check myself to make sure that I am not acting upon this bias. And I think that for many of you, you're going to find the same thing. And so it was really eye-opening for me to take that test and discover that I do have this bias. And it was sort of transformative for me because now I'm able to conduct myself in a way where I can sort of check that and make sure it's not permeating my decisions so that I can have that I can make fairer decisions. Does that make sense, Eve?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I just said, does that make sense, Eve?
It makes perfect sense, and I'm excited now. So if I just Google Harvard Implicit Bias quiz or test, I'm going to be able to find that link.
It will be at the top of the list. Yes, millions of people have taken this test.
All right, I'm a little frightened, although I am aware of my own unconscious bias. Yesterday, we heard that if you have a brain, you have unconscious bias.
Yes.
And I'm aware that I have unconscious bias, but I'm probably going to find out that I have more than I'm, owning at the moment, which is always good. Self-knowledge is always good on our journey for, on this journey.
Yeah, and one last thing, you can improve your bias too. I've taken my bias over, now that I'm aware of it, I've taken it over a period of time, and my bias is getting better.
Good.
So
Good.
just something to think about.
That's good news for all of us. Well, thank you again so much. I just love working with you. I'm enjoying working with you on the podcast and on the SPE Diversity, Equity, and Advisory Board. I hope we have many more years together to make a difference.
Too. Thank you, Eve.